Good morning, Colorado. You are listening to the Daily Sun Up. It's a conversation with the Colorado Sun. I'm team editor David Krause. Before we jump into today's conversation, here is a quick message from our sponsor.
When your number one fan is your number one threat, Stephen King's iconic thriller Misery is live on stage at the Arvada Center this fall. Tickets are on sale today, running September 4th through October 11th. Visit arvanacenter.org for tickets today. Support comes from Colorado Housing and Finance Authority. CHFA sponsors homebuyer education in English and Spanish and offers down payment assistance. Visit chfainfo.com/yourhome. CHFA is an equal housing lender.
Now, back to the show.
Hello again, listeners. I'm Kevin Simpson, writer and editor of the Sun's weekly book feature, Sunlit. We've arrived at the end of another work week, and as we usually do, we're going to talk books with a Colorado author whose writing takes us into the outdoor world. Heather Hansman's Powder Days was featured in Sunlit back in 2023, and prior to that, she published Downriver, Into the Future of Water in the West. But today we're going to talk with her about her new book, Fierce Country. Welcome, Heather, and thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
So for listeners who may not be familiar with your broader work, tell us a little about your background in the outdoor world.
Well, my background in the outdoor world starts, I guess, it goes way back when I was in college. I started working as a river guide, and I lived in Maine at the time. I went to college there, but guiding was really what brought me to Colorado originally, kind of following some other river guides. And then I started working at ski mountains in the winter. I worked at Beaver Creek right after college. And I did that kind of classic seasonal ski bum to river bum thing for a while before I ended up getting hurt and not wanting to work as seasonally anymore. And then I went to journalism school at CU in Boulder and then started working at Skiing Magazine. And that kind of became my line into the writing world. And so I've been doing that for a long time now, 15 years or something like that. And I transitioned to freelancing and kind of working on books probably 10 or 12 years ago. So that's what things look like for me these days.
So it sounds like in some ways that maybe your life and work were pointing you inevitably toward this book. Tell us a little about the stories in Fierce Country and how they came together.
Sure. Yeah, it is funny kind of once a book project comes together, you don't even realize how much things have been pushing you there since the very beginning. But Fierce Country, which is kind of the intertwined biographies of three women, Georgie White, who was one of the first Grand Canyon guides, Anne LaBastille, who was a mountain guide and early climate scientist, and Dolores LaChapelle, who was a kind of groundbreaking skier and environmental philosopher. It's the stories of their lives and how they kind of shaped the recreation and conservation worlds that I operate in. And kind of the reason why I wanted to write this book and kind of the question behind it was really kind of dates back to like my early days as a river guide. Because in that world, I never felt like I had heroes or role models as a woman coming up in that world. And I kind of, had always been immersed in adventure stories and, lived and worked and grew up in this world. And it took me a while to kind of really question that idea of why I didn't have people to look up to, why we kept kind of telling and retelling the same stories, and also how things might look different if we had brought in different voices.
So we've got an excerpt coming up this Sunday in our Sunlit section that deals with Georgie White, who you mentioned, the first female Grand Canyon guide. In your Q&A, you talk about being inspired as you learned more about these women. What did you take from Georgie White that you'd like to see reflected in your own life and work?
Georgie's a wild one. She had all these kind of crazy adventure stories. She swam through the Grand Canyon before people were really rafting it, and then she worked really hard to build up a company down there. In part because she was so obsessed with being on the river and being in that place, and she wanted to show other people how important it was and how much she loved it. So I think the things that really, and she was complicated. All these women were really had, complicated histories. They could be mean and judgmental. And Georgie was sort of a notorious liar, which made my reporting really complicated in a lot of ways. I had to, double check everything. But I was really inspired and interested. I think this question of why we feel so connected to landscape and then how that shapes our lives is something that I'm always scouting around and trying to figure out. And Georgie is somebody who, found a place she loved, decided to dedicate her life to it, and then made that happen and stuck to it, even when people were trying to push her out, even when the forces of government or climate or, social networks were working against her. She really knew what she loved and she stuck to it. And she saw the value of the place and really wanted to share that and show that. So I think there's a lot of things about her and all three of these women, really, they're kind of knowing their sense of what was right and wrong and then working really hard to protect it that was something I really kind of pulled out of all their stories.
Well, I always like to hear stories about writers' process. And you mentioned, I think, when you went to the Grand Canyon to experience it, like Georgie White did, how did you approach that as a reporter? I'm guessing maybe you didn't swim the the river down there, but maybe you did. How did you go about reporting that?
Sure. Well, I had to go down the Grand Canyon to make
Of
the
course.
reporting on this book work. I couldn't do it without that. So I signed up to be a swamper, which is kind of an unpaid intern on a river trip, because I felt, all three of these women have passed away and none of them have living children. So to kind of recreate their stories, a lot of what I was doing was archival work and going back through things that they had written and things that had been written about them. But I really felt like I needed a sense of the place to really be able to tell the story right. And there wasn't any way I could do that without going into those landscapes and being in there and kind of seeing what it felt like to be in the canyon, getting sunburned or getting monsooned on or, rowing through some of the rapids. I needed that texture to really be able to tell this story right. And that was true of all three. Dolores LaChapelle lived in Silverton, which is about an hour from where I live down in Durango. So I could kind of go up into those mountains and trace where she had been to understand them and to understand kind of what was at stake and what was important for them.
So as a practical matter in reporting that, do you go out into the landscape and just sort of experience it and then later on come back and record in some way your thoughts and observations? Or are you one of those folks who's got to have a recorder or a notebook and, record your thoughts as you go along through the landscape?
I wish that I could be one of those people who just retained it, but my memory is not as good as it used to be. And I know that about myself. So I know that I have to kind of be recording and tracking things as I go. And it's not very romantic, but I use my phone a lot because I always have my phone on me so I can take notes or I can record a little audio snippet or even taking pictures I think can be really helpful to kind of have that. So you remember what the rocks look like or what direction you were looking. I think having all those context clues is really important for writing scene correctly and kind of getting all the pieces. I have one of those little waterproof notebooks that I stick in my life jacket. But I think it's trying to get, I think of it sometimes like you're a painter and you want the whole palette to then be able to put the picture down in the way that you want. So I think for me, it's the more notes I can take, the more I can get in when I'm out there, the better.
Mm-hmm. So you also mentioned some of the research that you did for the book was somewhat different because it involved a lot of archival work. And I think you also mentioned in the Q&A, it took you down some rabbit holes as you start looking into things. I just wondered, what did you learn that didn't make the book that might be something that you came across and thought, well, this might not be something for this book, but I might need to come back to this later on?
I think my editor cut something like 40,000 words out of the first draft. The first draft was way, way longer. And part of that was because I had to learn so much to kind of understand the context. There was a lot that got taken out about Grand Canyon river running history. There's so many fascinating characters and so many wild stories. And it's so entangled with kind of how we manage and think about public land and who has access to it and how we've changed that over time, which I think it could be and probably is a whole other book. So a lot of that stuff got got cut out. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I had to learn. I mean, that's one of the coolest parts of my job, but also one of the most frustrating. I'm sure you too. It's like you have to learn so much to be able to compress something into a story. But that means that some of your, favorite sentences or favorite things that you learn get left behind.
So, you're as a journalist, of course, we deal with the everyday of things. We talk to people and record their thoughts and facts and whatnot. But when you're dealing with three women who are no longer with us, what kind of challenge did that present for you that was maybe a little different than when when you can call somebody up and have a conversation and you are relying on the archival work? Did it make it more difficult to really get a handle on your subjects?
I think so. I think kind of trying to understand them as people was harder because I never got, and I hadn't met any of them. I never got to, talk to any of them face to face. And I'm lucky that they all wrote to a certain degree. So I had kind of like primary source the writings of their own. But like I said, Georgie's was, you had to fact check everything from Georgie's story to make sure it was right. But yeah, it was really, I think I'm always surprised and pretty amazed at how much people are willing to share stories once you ask. And the people who kind of carried on, both Anne and Dolores kind of had somebody that they knew who was like the keeper of their archive. And those people were really open and willing to talk to me. I got to talk to folks who guided for Georgie and went on trips with her. The Northern Arizona University has a really good river running library. So I kind of got to go through sources for that. So there are, it was, the discovery process was really interesting, but there still are, it is really different to kind of try and paint a portrait from other people's words than to, be having a conversation with Kevin. And then I can kind of like use Kevin's quotes and the room that we're in to create the story. So it was I had to kind of stretch some different muscles.
So in your Q&A and earlier in our conversation, you brought up the challenge of writing about heroes. I think maybe anybody who's been in journalism has run into that. In fact, where sometimes you kind of wish you hadn't met the heroes because once you kind of start peeling the layers away, you learn things that maybe aren't always what you had hoped. So how did you approach that conundrum with the three women in the book of sort of wanting them to be heroes, but also wanting to accurately represent exactly who they were as human beings?
I mean, I think the answer to that is it took me a long time. I had to kind of work through my own relationship with all these women. And kind of as I learned more, there were really frustrating parts where they weren't sort of living up to my expectations, or they were, hard on other women, or they weren't telling the truth, or there were kind of all these things that made them complicated characters. But I think that also made them more interesting and more real. And that felt important, especially as a journalist, to kind of get the whole picture. And I think part of, one of the questions in this book is about the idea of heroes and what makes a hero. And I think in so many ways, the people that we have held up as heroes in the past also had those flaws and bad behaviors, but they maybe we weren't necessarily always getting a complete picture. Like, I think it's easy to put somebody up on a pedestal and just look at the shiny side of things. But I think that then creates a story that's hard to live up to and doesn't paint the whole picture. So in this book, it felt really important to kind of show the impressive and the ugly sides of these big people to really get it right.
Well, and part of the foundation of your book addresses, as you mentioned earlier, whether it's different to be a woman in the outdoor world. What did the experience of exploring these three women do to either confirm or challenge that?
Yeah, this is something that I've wrestled with, I think, in my whole adult life, and also in the outdoor world, and also as a journalist trying to tell stories about women in these spaces that are traditionally male dominated, because there are things that are different about the experience of being in a minority group. And one of the things I got to dig into about this was like the research behind that. And what does it mean to be a woman in these kind of spaces? What are the barriers? What are the kind of like social and biological differences, which can get really complicated and murky. So I think that helped me have an understanding of why things felt different. And then there's also kind of all these social norms and ways that we habituate, even young kids, boys are taken out into the outdoors by family members more than young girls are, and they're encouraged to mess up more. So there's all this kind of patterning that happens that I was able to pin down, and that helped make more sense of my experience. And it helped, I think I'm always in these spaces, I'm always worried, and people that I talk to are worried, like, you don't want to be marginalized as a woman. You don't want to be put in a silo. You don't want to be separate. You don't want to be a woman writer. You just want to be a writer. And I think this has helped me kind of untangle the reasons behind some of those feelings and frustrations and put some light on them, which I think you can't kind of work to address issues until you know what they are. So for me, it was helpful to kind of understand the pieces.
Exactly. Well, I know you live down in Durango, and there's a very vibrant literary community down there, that whole area, Four Corners area. And yeah, I know you mentioned that you've been toying with the idea of fiction. There's a lot of fiction writers down there. Some of them we've had on the podcast and featured in Sunlit. How big a leap would that be for you, do you think, to go from what you've been doing to embracing fiction?
It feels scary. Like, it feels very different. The pieces are, I saw Susan Orlean speak at the Tattered Cover years and years ago. And I remember her saying, with nonfiction, you kind of have the pieces. You just have, and you can use those to build the house. And with fiction, you have to create the pieces. So that seems like a whole different kind of writing. But I think some of these questions, like the stuff we were just talking about gender equity and who has access, I think there's a lot of depth and complexity in those questions. And some of them I think would be more interesting if I was able to approach it from fiction instead of just the fact-based, here's what happened. I think there's ways to kind of pull out more interesting stories. So yeah, there's I'm thinking about it.
So if you went that direction, do you think you would sort of stick with an outdoor framework, or would you like to just get away and do something completely different?
I think it would be hard to do something completely different. I've been joking with my editor about outdoor romance novels. That's actually the way I'd want to go. But I think there's so much. I mean, any kind of microcosm has its own society and details and stuff. So I think that that's a world that hasn't been explored that much from fiction in a way that feels right to me. So I think, yeah, maybe there's some space there.
Well, we've been talking with Heather Hansman, author of Fierce Country, available at fine bookstores everywhere. And be sure to catch an excerpt and more from Heather in our Sunlit feature starting Sunday. Thanks for joining us, Heather.
Thanks, Kevin. It was great talking to you.
And as always, listeners, thank you for making the Daily Sun-Up part of your day. Have a great weekend.
Thanks for listening. And finally, here are a few stories that you should know about today.
To raise the $20 billion Colorado needs over the next 30 years to ensure it has enough water, measures such as imposing fees on data centers and renewable energy companies, taxing sod grass, or funding a special trust could be part of the equation. That's according to a report recently issued by a special state task force. A section of the Durango airport is serving as a home base for large aircraft fighting wildfires in Colorado and 8 other western states. The Sun took a tour that gave us an inside look at the daily operations and how the dozens of aircraft and crew are working in concert. To commemorate the 150th anniversary of statehood Saturday, hundreds of hikers will be scaling 55 of Colorado's highest peaks. It's a repeat of 50 years ago, when 645 climbers scrambled up 14ers to celebrate Colorado's 100th birthday. Volunteers with numerous outdoor groups will be leading teams up the peaks.
To read these stories and much more, visit our website, coloradosun.com. As an award-winning nonprofit news outlet, we take our mission of credible, independent journalism seriously, and you can check out our trust indicators at coloradosun.com/ethics. Our music is by the Denver-based Matt Skellinger Group. A link to their music is in our show notes, and a special thanks to Swallow Hill Music. I'm David Krause. See you next time.